And we're live.
And we are live. So the story goes like this. Young writer John Buck calls me up in a tizzy. He's freaking out. He's like, Craig, nobody knows anything about idealism. Nobody knows anything about idealism, the hard problem of consciousness. What are we going to do? I was like, don't worry, John. I found this expert. I found the resident expert, this guy named Lone Sparta. You might know him as Scold Philosophy. This guy knows everything there is to know on the hard problem of consciousness and how it relates to idealism. We'll have him on our channel and we'll, pick his brain and we'll have him teach us. John was like, cool, I'll call him up. And he agreed to show up. So here he is, the resident expert in all things consciousness and all aspects of idealism, the Lone Sparta. Wow, oh my God, I'm freaking out. I can't believe they got him live. They got him live. I can't believe it. So, Lone Sparta, you want to introduce yourself? Tell everybody who you are and why you're here.
Yeah, so it didn't quite go down like that, but I let's see. I think I first got in contact with Craig, and I was like, I've been on Twitter for a while, and I've seen that people really don't understand how philosophy of mind works, and so I was
And idealism.
mostly idealism, like
Right.
That's pretty much what we're talking about today. But yeah, like they just will butcher it. So I was like, hey, why don't we do a stream and we'll kind of cover everything. We'll clear up some misconceptions.
Right. So the first time I noticed you, I guess you've been on Twitter for a while, but I noticed you jumped in on a thread. I was talking with this guy, Dr. Theosib, who's a good guy. He's a bright guy. I think he has a PhD in something. But he was asking us, or first he started asking me what the hard problem of consciousness was. And then you kind of joined the thread and started explaining to him. And you were explaining it, as far as I can tell, really accurately enough for him to clearly understand it. And he just didn't seem to want to understand it. That was my analysis. But do you want to start there? Oh, before we start, actually, I didn't realize you and John were friends in real life.
Yeah, we went out for lunch once, and we've talked on Discord a lot. Yeah.
So have you been around for a while and I just didn't notice you before?
I've been around for like 2 years or so in terms
Oh,
of
wow.
like philosophy, but I've only been on Twitter for about like 7 months, so I was laying low before that.
Okay. So that's why I hadn't heard of you, because I only noticed you like a few months ago when you jumped in on a couple of threads, and I was like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. So, yeah. So what you can start at the beginning if you want. You're not a Christian, right? You're a deist, and you can tell us like some background, how you got interested in the topics. If you want to just give us some background information, then we'll go into it.
Yeah, so I'm a deist, but my leanings, I mean, I'm right in the middle where I'm like half theist, half deist. I think I'm still kind of figuring out if, about organized religion or where I fall in that category, Do I
Right.
am I a Christian, or, do I believe this or do I believe that? But for now, I'm just kind of I'm like a non-religious theist, deist, just interchangeably terms, basically. Like I just
Right. You lean towards the theist camp because you're involved in a lot of theist friendly territory, like idealism and the stuff we're going to talk about. That's how I would describe it. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think and just in terms of the people I interact with and the people I'm around all the time, I'm more on the theist side.
Right. You recognize that we embody the love of Jesus and we're really good, great human beings. So you're like, I want to be like these guys more than the other guys.
Always, yeah.
So what started you on idealism and hard problem of consciousness in particular? Were you taking classes in it, just interested?
Yeah, so I started in philosophy of religion. That's kind of like about 2 years ago. That's kind of where I started. And I was like, searching around there. I was kind of like figuring out things. I was like half doing philosophy, half learning the history of like early Christianity and things like that. And then one of my friends, we were talking on Discord one day, and he brought up something about idealism. And I was like, well, what's that? he like explains the theory. He's like, it's a theory and philosophy of the mind. And after that call, I was like, I kind of want to find out more about this. So I bought like a book. I read some online papers. I got in contact with some people, and I started to kind of like really get into it. And then I bought like David Chalmers' book I have up here on my shelf, and I did a lot of those things, and progressively just kind of like got more into it, and and enjoyed it. So philosophy of the mind and philosophy of religion have kind of been the main two corners of philosophy I've focused in. But yeah, philosophy of the mind, I didn't realize it for a while. Like, it was like a year that I was into philosophy, and I was just completely oblivious to it because, I was raised in a Christian household. So I automatically just thought, well, soul, or, just we have a soul and that's it. I didn't really,
Right.
yeah.
And then so there was a duality, like it's either dualism or physicalism. And you didn't realize there's this whole really well thought out middle ground where, we'll bring up Castrop in a second. He's coming on your channel, right?
Oh, yeah. By the way, on Monday, the 28th, Castrop will be doing an interview on our channel. Me and Chris, we'll be doing an interview with him. We'll talk over materialism and idealism and, a lot of that stuff, the science behind it. So, yeah, if you're ever interested in that, just go ahead and check that out.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah.
going to be awesome. That's what got me started on metaphysical idealism, because I saw him streaming. I think it was originally on T Jump's channel. And then there was this guy, Dr. Richard Brown, who's kind of like the resident YouTube expert. I'm pretty sure he's an atheist. He has a PhD in either psychology or philosophy of mind. And he does a lot of really highbrow interviews with like Philip Goff and guys like that. And
Yeah.
Castrop was on his channel and he did a really thorough interview. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I know both of them. They're really cool guys. I think Dr. Brown, he's really good. His theories he's a physicalist, but his
Right.
theory, I believe he's non-reductive. So I enjoy his theories. I think his work in things like, philosophy of the mind and the science, neuroscience and cognitive science is really good. His interview with Castrop is excellent. Granted,
Excellent.
Yeah,
it's the one I keep posting to everybody and say, here, watch this. Like that guy who was asking us about hard problem of consciousness. I was like, here, watch this. He's like, it's 2 hours long. I'm like, you've been debating with us for 4 hours. You can watch this and learn it and learn it well. But go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, no, Castrop, any interview I've seen of Castrop has been pretty good. He does lectures through, it's called like the Essentia Foundation. I would check those out. Really good work there. But yeah, so it kind of like I just got into, I was like, well, what is this middle ground, Because I would always thought, well, it was where zombies or we have a soul. There's just no middle ground, It's kind of like
no in between.
Right. And then I figured, well, what if, and I kind of like, I'd always been thinking about this, but I didn't know how to put it into play. I was kind of like, couldn't there be a middle ground? Like, does it have to be just these two binary options? And then my friend told me about that. And I was like, that's really cool. And so I checked it out. And then I was like, this is good. And then I kind of like went into the philosophy behind it. I was like, you know what? This makes sense. And so from then on, I was kind of like, I would defend it and I would talk about it. I think idealism actually gives a great pathway to God. Or, I think if you're going to believe in God, idealism is one of the better theories of mind, just because it allows for something like God to really be in there, like
right.
what's better, God giving us individual souls or God being the ground of all of us, like him being the ground of our consciousness and our consciousness grounding the physical. Like, I think it's just a little bit better of a theory, but yeah, so I just kind of like got into it and I am where I am now.
Yeah. So so are you actually an idealist or are you just interested in idealism?
Oh no, I'm an idealist.
Okay. And what's your particular spin on it? What do you call yourself? And explain it.
So it's really hard because idealism is still kind of a work in progress in philosophy. Like,
yeah,
it's
I agree
been around
totally
for a while. but there's just not a lot of action in it. I think Castrop is kind of bringing that back, but there's just not been a ton of things surrounding it. You can find a load of work on dualism and physicalism and all that stuff, but idealism has kind of been left to the side as just kind of like a fringe weird theory.
Right.
So I think, yeah, I'm trying to like bring that back, have it recognized as an actual good theory of mine and be able
Well,
to.
Castrop is going to single-handedly do that by himself because his I read his idea of the world and materialism baloney, and I watched about probably 10 or 15 of his interviews at this point, and he's really thought it through, like all the bases covered, and the parts where it can be grounded in empiricism and facts are pretty well spelled out. He's got that whole consciousness as a whirlpool, that whole analogy about the whirlpool and stuff like that. So his version of metaphysical idealism is really nuanced, and as far as I'm concerned, really thoroughly thought through all the way through, like almost every aspect. The only part where he struggles is when, I don't know if you watched, there was a Myth Vision podcast, and Myth Vision is a really good guy. I didn't know him. I just watched him interviewing, and he was struggling to understand like how the real world actually exists in metaphysical idealism. That's the part where everyone kind of doesn't understand it. So
Right. So I agree with Castrop a lot, but I think his theory needs to kind of be tweaked a little bit to
yeah, I
account.
agree. Yep.
So I think if you could tweak that, and this is something I might run over in our interview, is to be able to kind of run over this and be like, is there a way to say idealism is true, but at the same time there is a kind of external world? And I think this is where a lot of my work in this, like I haven't written anything. I have no published papers, but when I do talk about it, this is kind of like where I try and come in. I'm like, I don't see a reason why on idealism there can't be an external world of sort. Like I think his theory, if his theory was tweaked by a little bit to allow for the external world, I think he would have all bases covered.
Yes, I agree. Well, he knows that there is a material world. He's a scientist, and he was trained as a scientist. His starts as consciousness is the ontological primitive, which could easily be true, and there's no contradiction there. And if you build from there, there can be you can account for the material world being real. It's just hard for him to put that into words. That's how I see it. How does that make sense to you, or is that how you see it?
Yeah. So I think a lot of issue, and this is something I might get into later. I think we're planning to, but um, the issue that idealism doesn't posit an external world or a material external world. But I think we need to rethink this for a second. Like I think Kastrup gets lost. Like I think he does a good job of arguing how consciousness could be or is the primitive.
Right.
I don't think he like I don't think he understands the issue with having with not having an answer to the external world. And this is why I still think he has some work to do, because if people don't take him seriously because he doesn't really have an answer to that, and they're like, well, if he doesn't know how to answer that, then why are we going to take his theory seriously? So I think I think he does a great job of arguing that consciousness is kind of the primitive, but it's kind of like he needs to tweak some things.
Well,
Sorry
wait,
for interrupting, but we got a
Go ahead.
question from the chat. Can you just sort of lay out basically what idealism is so that people can sort of get a core understanding of what it is?
Sure. You want to do that, or do you want me to do it? Doesn't matter to me.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. I think each idealist can kind of put a spin on their own theory, but my theory is basically consciousness is the primitive, so it is the basis of our reality. It is the basis of what we experience and what we go through every day. So I think, for example, let's compare this to dualism. Dualism is going to posit some type of immaterial. I don't.
Supernatural is the key. It's always positing a supernatural. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't always like using the word supernatural, but like immaterial, um, being or state of what it is like to be, separate from the physical us. So we have our body, we have our brain, we have all our, tongue and everything, and then we have the soul. But idealism is going to say, let's flip that. Let's take that consciousness is sort of kind of the body in dualism, and the soul is the physical. So it's kind of like the physical is, byproduct or is separate from, I mean, not always separate, but yeah, kind of sort of separate from, this consciousness or this, what it is like to be.
I would say pretty much the same thing. I would say, like, in materialism, material posits that material stuff is the ontological primitive, which leads directly to the hard problem of consciousness, which basically is, how are you deriving consciousness, what it is like to be phenomenal consciousness, from stuff, mass, charge, spin, because in principle they seem irreducible one to the other. So where Kastrup goes along, and Kastrup's version, and I guess what Lone Sparta's version is similar, is their starting point, rather than being materialism, is consciousness itself is the ontological primitive. Then you have other things that you have to account for. But as far as I'm concerned, Kastrup does a really pretty thorough job of trying to account for it, up until the point where he gets asked, well, wait a minute. He was asked by Myth Vision the right question. There's a tree outside my window, and I know it's there. And when I go to bed at night, it's still there. And when I wake up in the morning, it's still there. Are you telling me it's not there? And his answer is, he starts talking about the veil of perception, and he starts saying a lot of words that don't quite make sense of how the real material world is both there and not there at the exact same time. I don't know if that's how you phrase it, Lone Sparta. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that? Or
Yeah, so consciousness is just a primitive of the physical, is basically what I would say. It's the primitive, above the material. That's just a short, Wikipedia definition. But yeah, I'd agree with that.
right. And so you have a more, the original idealist is usually Bizet Berkeley, and he says that it's just mind and there's nothing else. And that's kind of, obviously, we know that's false, because there is a real material world. It's just to what degree is it real? And I don't know. You tell me. So where are you at with what you're trying to work out?
There's multiple ways you can go about this. So in Berkeley's theory, his theory would work, but what you would have to have is some type of grounding. So for some type of monistic idealist, a god could be that. So that's where a lot of theistic idealism comes from.
Right.
So that's why the tree outside my window is always there, is because
God keeps it there, and God is looking at it even when you're not. Right?
Yeah.
Is that? Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
So his theory could work, but I don't think that's really what Berkeley wanted to do. I think he kind of wanted just consciousness to just be it. Like it's the final thing. He didn't want anything grounding it. He just kind of wanted that to be it. So I have some issues with monistic idealism, but I think there's a way to combine and say there's an external world, but there's also consciousness. And so I think what we have to do is kind of find that middle ground too, and not hold to some monistic idealism where it's just, oh well, everything is consciousness and mind and that's it, or materialism where everything is material and that's it. So yeah, I think Berkeley's could work, but you'd have to do some arguing.
Right. So did you explore panpsychism for a little bit?
Yeah.
I mentioned Philip Goff. Did you check out any of his stuff?
Yeah. So Yeah, I've watched Philip Golf. I have some good friends that are panpsychists. I think John is like half panpsychist. I don't know.
Our little John Buck here. Yeah, I think, but that's because Emerson Green is like gotten it into his head, is like is like working on him. He's being
Exactly.
influenced. He's being
It's
influenced in DMs. Like, you got to be with panpsychism, dude.
he's got
I
my
think
whole
that's
family held hostage, and he's like trying to get more panpsychists in order to like
well.
double.
His channel has actually got really good. It's a
Oh yeah,
really good starting point for philosophy of mind. Like he gives you a lot of the basics. He even brings up Schopenhauer and stuff like that. Go ahead, Lone. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, you're fine. But yeah, so I looked into that. Um, I think it has some truth to it. I think it has the right idea. It's on the right track. But I think idealism is kind of the next step. I think trying to posit that every substance or every, I mean, there's different versions, but every sort of thing has some type of conscious or subjective experience, right? Whether that be very little, almost like complete, almost nothing, or us, I think honestly, idealism, I would argue, is a little bit. I'm not 100% sure how to word it, but it's better because instead
It's
of
more parsimonious. It's more logically coherent, and it's it works better. Like when I saw those two debate, the debate wasn't even close, even though I lean towards panpsychism because it's more. It doesn't quite work as just a total theory of consciousness, but as a interpretive framework, it works really well. Idealism. That's how I would say it. I don't know if that made complete sense.
yeah. So I think idealism just takes panpsychism and takes it up a level.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Um, I think I think panpsychism is a great way to kind of introduce people to this way of thinking about consciousness. But you have things like the combination problem that I think idealism solves. Um, and I think idealism works better. I guess that's just the plain way to put it.
Well, there's also details of panpsychism that could easily be true. Like there's a theory of consciousness that I've been checking out with Henroff and Penrose. That proto consciousness begins with like at the like an amoeba, and it's seeking pleasure, and that proto consciousness does begin at like that type of level. I don't really quite understand where they're going with it yet, but there's definitely aspects of panpsychism that could be true. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it's not total BS,
Yes, exactly. It just needs to be thought through completely, and then all the bases covered. See, that's the difference. Is that Kastrup approached it like a scientist, and it shows. Like he thought through all the different aspects of his particular version of metaphysical idealism, and then matched it to what was available empirically. So he's got, when they ask him about this thing, he'll go to this series of experiments that as evidence for most of it. The only problem where he struggles is explaining how there is a real world that we are all participating in that is there when we're not, experiencing it, which is complicated. It's really complicated to explain that correctly. Even to like think of that correctly is probably hard.
Right. And I think Castro does a great job arguing for what most people wonder about idealism. But when people really start, like, they're like, okay, this kind of makes sense. I can sort of see your point. But what about this tree outside of my house? And then he
Right.
kind of a little bit caught up. But yeah, I think if he could find a way to combine what he talks about now, what he has right now, and then combine it with like a non-monistic view, he would be a lot better off. Like I think he just has to kind of find a way to do that.
To balance it so that because consciousness could, if the choice is between materialism as the ontological primitive and consciousness, if it's binary, it's idealism. There's no question. But there's probably a better phrase, better thought out middle ground that kind of accounts for both, right? That's how I think. I don't know if you agree with that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So I guess what I would make is you have monistic idealism or like some type of absolute idealism. I think that's what it's referred to in a lot of places, where everything is mental. Everything is mental states. There's nothing out there that is beyond our experience, right?
Right.
And then you have some type of like non-monistic view, and it's kind of like it most of the time it's just like plain idealism or just kind of like external world idealism where there is a external world, but it is not the factor here that I always have to distinguish is the external world on external world idealism is not the same as the external world on something like illusionism, right? So you just that is one thing that I wanted to clear up. You know, they're different, but they're still an external world.
Right. So how would you explain it? Do people know? You want to tell us what illusionism is, just in case
Right.
people don't understand it? The theory of consciousness.
Yeah. So illusionism, it's it's proposed by people like Daniel Dennett.
Yeah,
Well,
he's the most famous that I
yeah,
know of.
Keith Frankish. Um, oh, I forget his name. Michael. I'm forgetting his last name. Um, but yeah, I think the illusionism is basically the idea that the material brain, our brain, creates the illusion of qualia or what it is like to be.
Right.
So so basically our brain consciousness is an illusion created by a material object. But yeah, that's basically what illusionism is. So on illusionism, there is such thing as my desk, right? So
Right.
my desk is there. It is actually my desk. Um, it's just, you know, my brain is in taking that sensory experience and producing an illusion of what it's like to be, you know, just take any example. Um,
What it's like to listen to a concert, and
yeah,
you're that's like what it's like to be you when you go to the bathroom.
right. So
There's what.
there's actually someone singing there on materialism.
Right.
It's just, our brain then takes in that perception, twists it, and then creates the illusion of what it's like to be experiencing that concert. So basically, that's illusionism in its simplest form.
Right.
Uh, so on that form of materialism, there is actually physical objects, an external world that is physical, made up of atoms and combined together. On external world idealism, how I explain it, and I think this is something, it kind of gets into what they call like the argument from logical properties or something like that, or mental properties, where basically the external world is just information, um, waves, and particles, right? And
Right.
consciousness, the fundamental part, is what combines this and creates our surroundings. So there's not a desk there until there's some type of conscious observer. There's some type of consciousness there present, basically.
Right.
So that's sort of kind of the idea. Um, one question I like to ask in terms of this is, can you describe to me a physical object without using any type of conscious properties? Can you describe to me how a dresser would look or feel or anything like that without using any type of perception or anything that has to do with consciousness? Most honest people are going to tell you no. You can't
Right.
do everything. Everything is filtered through our perception of the world or our consciousness or what it's like to be. So I think
Right.
that's one major factor that kind of pulled me in this direction. But yeah, like that's like a just baseline of.
Yeah, and that's really obviously true. That's everything is seen through the veil of our perception. And a lot of times we are re representing things not as they actually are, but as they appear to us, like a desk in front of us, the thing is actually particles of motion. It's not what it looks like to us. We're representing it back to ourselves in a way that makes the most sense, but it isn't actually what it is. And there's a lot of philosophy on that, with going back to Kant and Schopenhauer. And
So one of the things I think you'll see a lot of internet materialist proponents, right? So what is their go-to answer to other stuff? Well, neuroscience. Neuroscience
right,
is this or this. But I don't think neuroscience really hinders idealism at all. In fact, I think it helps it, right? So neuroscience will tell you that um, everything we perceive, our brain is then twisting and making into the image we see, right? Well, that's fine.
right.
Idealism. That's honestly my idea of idealism. Consciousness is the primitive. It has to be there for something physical to exist. So I think a lot of times the whole, oh, look at neuroscience, look at this, is just not a very good.
Well, and then you can line. Nobody's arguing. Even Kastrup understands that there are neurological correlates, and like you can line up easy problem of consciousness. The hard problem is totally different. It's that it's irreducible to get to phenomenal consciousness. The phenomenal consciousness itself starts as the ontological primitive, and then there's no contradiction. There is the material world out there, which isn't quite how we perceive it. It's different. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I kind of like explain it to people this way. So if consciousness is primitive,
Right.
and it is the filter of everything, then you want correlates. You correlations is expected, in fact, preferred. So I don't see correlations as an issue really. Now there are obviously philosophers and scientists and very smart people who disagree with me on that, but I don't see it as an issue. And I think that's one major thing on social media that people really butcher about idealism. It's just that, well, you're saying that, there's supposed to be no correlations then. Like, no, it's fine. In fact, it's expected. So, I mean, that's a major one.
Well, the other thing, like you probably know Mary's Room, right?
Yeah. By Searle, yeah.
Yeah. But one of the points of that a lot of people don't grasp is that a color is not an intrinsic property of something. A color is a reflection of the light. So you're perceiving the color, but it's not in the substance of the material. Do you understand what I mean? Like that's the part that they're not getting. Your perception of the color is what's giving its reality. It's not intrinsic to the thing itself. It's not like there's a red item. It's the reflection of the light off of that item that makes it appear red to you. That's the part of Mary's Room that people aren't quite getting. It's your experience that actually, I'm not saying this very well, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I think Mary's Room has kind of like it's kind of, for me, from what I see, is kind of an under talked about example or challenge to materialism. But I think most people who bring it up don't fully grasp it. Now, I'm not saying I fully grasp it either, but I don't think they fully understand it or use it correctly. So that's why I think Mary's Room's kind of been blown off, especially by more just pop level people. It's just kind of been like, it's not really that big of a deal. But I think if one actually understands what it's saying and what it's getting at, it becomes a very good good problem for us, but very challenging problem for the materialist, because it shows that not everything can be
is reducible to its material components. It proves it more or less. It's like a concert. A concert has material, but that's basically irrelevant to what a concert is. It's only when you put on the headphone and listen to it that you get any real understanding of what a concert is. If you just reduce it to its material components, that's more or less an irrelevant story about it. It's one aspect of it, but it's irrelevant to some degree. It's not what's actually going on. I think that was clear. I don't know if that was clear. John, was that clear? Or was that gobbledygook? Was that word salad? John, did I speak word salad or was that clear? He left.
I don't know, Craig. You're always speaking word salad.
I'm always kind of word salad. That. Yeah, that's one that could always be used. Word salad. I don't know. I thought that was clear. What do you say, Lone Spar? Did that make sense?
Yeah, so yeah, I think that explains it pretty well. Um, so I think this is just there are challenges. There's things like the vagueness argument against materialism. There's certain things that come along with the baggage of materialism. Now something like non-reductive materialism, I can see. I don't. I It doesn't really 100% make sense to me. Like, it's like you still kind of run into the same problems. You're just adding more to it. So, I, I mean, yeah, I think you explained it pretty well.
Well, cool. So, so what's your take? He's going to come. He's going to be on your channel. What did you say? In a couple of days, the
Yeah,
28th or something.
20.
I don't. And then you're going to go over the basic of it with him. Have you watched a lot of his interviews and debates on?
Yeah, so I've watched a lot of his stuff. I don't know. I don't think I've watched one. I think I watched one debate of his. It wasn't so much a debate, more like a discussion, but he did pretty well. I think a lot of people expect, even professional philosophers of the mind don't fully grasp it and don't fully understand it. So I think, when he's out there kind of clearing things up, I don't think Kastrup's work can fully prove idealism, such as his issue with the external world. But I do think he is a very good introduction, or he does well at clearing things up. So, in our interview, I think we're going to talk over, why does he think um, why does he think materialism fails, or why does he think idealism is better? What's the definition of idealism? That's another big one. Um, so yeah, I think he does a really great job with that stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have anything you want to tell us in terms of your own definitions of why you think materialism fails and how you define idealism? Anything that we didn't that you think you want to say more about?
I don't. I think I covered a lot of it. Obviously, there is a lot more to cover. Um, but I think just materialism is kind of I don't want to say like it's failing, but I think it's having issues. And so, for me, idealism is kind of the better option. Obviously, I differ with people. There are all type anywhere you go. You go to dualism, there are different types of dualists. You go to materialism, there's different types of materialists. You go to panpsychists. There's different types of panpsychists. I mean, you go anywhere and you have differences. But I think I've explained things as well as it could simply. But yeah, I think the big argument for me, and this is kind of what I always point out to people, in I don't 100% remember the book. It's like Idealism, or Essays on Idealism or something like that. There's an article in there about problem of mental properties or something like that, where basically they go over how if you were to strip any physical property of mental states or mental perception, you couldn't describe it and it just wouldn't exist. So I always encourage people to kind of go look up that. I encourage people to go and look into people like Castro. Um, I'm not. There are not a ton of other idealists out there that like really explain things good. Um, I think Keith Ward is pretty good.
Keith Ward is pretty good. I saw. Did you watch his debate with Daniel Dennett? It was really pretty interesting.
No, I have not got a chance to. I'll have to go and watch that.
It was interesting. It was a good debate. The problem with what you said, the thing you said before, like, so there are physicalists and there are materialists and there are dualists. The problem when you're dealing with really smart people is that they're able to have really nuanced takes on something like physicalism, and they're able to make things a lot more convincing than they might not otherwise be. Like, that's what Daniel Dennett, he's, you know, Castro can't stand Dennett, but the problem is Daniel Dennett is smart enough to kind of run smoke screens on some of the problems for physicalism. And there's a lot of people who do that with like dualism and things like that. You know, if the person's intelligent enough, they can come up with a nuanced, really hard to grapple with version of you know, a theory that makes it harder to pin down where the mistakes are. That's one of the things I've noticed. I don't know if you would agree with that.
So this is one thing that I also get at is it is very easy to make your theory sound evidential and true when you
Right.
throw on the big words. So Dennett does this a lot. I enjoy Dennett. I think he's a good writer, good philosopher, but he does this a lot. Where he'll throw out big words. He'll say the thing 3 different times, which in his mind makes it true. He'll restate facts. He'll, take one source of evidence and drive that to the ground as far as he can. So I think that's when people kind of have to start seeing through that and kind of thinking through what these people are saying, thinking through these problems, and not just letting it kind of them just kind of like, oh, that's not really an issue. Because on my version, and you'll kind of see where even on their version it has the exact same problem. They've just restated it differently. So yeah, I think one thing is people not need to kind of like see through the smoke screen and be
Right. Well, for example, Patricia Churchland was on Aaron Ra, and he had been in a debate where the philosophy of mind came up, and he was saying, when I get Patricia Churchland on my program, she's going to show you all. He was arguing against dualism. But then when she got on the show, I couldn't wait to see what her arguments were going to be. But her objection to David Chalmers was like, oh, he's an idiot. He's not a neuroscientist. I'm like, okay, why is he an idiot? And what's wrong with this argument? Like, she didn't even spell any of it out. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Go ahead.
Right. So a lot of times, especially with people, higher up philosophers, is they'll just blow off somebody. So even though Chalmers, I would put him in the top 3 of the current philosophers of mind. A lot of people like the Churchlands or people like that would just kind of blow it off. He's dualism is out of date, not true, and it's been disproven.
Right.
Such as in Consciousness Explained, and in Bacteria to Backenbach, Dennett basically just straight off the bat in the introduction just ruled out dualism. Just straight in the introduction and in the first chapter, just dualism's done, it's stupid, goodbye. So I think it's kind of like, well, even if you think that person's theory is stupid, let's take a look at it first before you just write it up. And so
you got to give a cogent explanation as to why it fails, before you just move on. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Aaron Ra is obviously not philosophically inept in the he's just not, he doesn't understand anything. Like the guy he's just inept in it. But I think Aaron Ra's thing is that, well, this famous scientist says it's true, therefore it's true. Like he doesn't. Right. But yeah, I watched that interview with Churchland, and
it was bad. He asked her really bad questions for like the first half hour. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think
it was really bad.
Yeah, so he didn't fully understand it, so he was asking just weird questions. She is known just with interactions on Twitter. I've seen her, I've had interactions with her. She's very kind of dogmatic about it. It's very just, well, if you don't accept my view, you reject science.
Right.
You reject philosophy. And so people kind of have to start seeing through this. And this is on the pop level. on the activist level, especially in terms of like atheist activists, you see this a lot, and this is the big thing that frustrates me. Um, it's just if you don't agree with my view that this scientist agrees with, then you're just automatically you're stupid and you don't know what you're talking about. So it's kind of like people have to see through that. And I believe so. If someone's looking for rethinking consciousness, the science of subjective experience is a really great book.
Yeah,
I
that
think
sounds good. Who is that?
so. This is by hold on, let me grab the book here. Michael somebody. So he's a neuroscientist and an illusionist, but he has a theory called the attention schema theory. And so he lays it out in a very non-dogmatic, um, funny, simple layman way. And so I think this is the way materialists kind of need to go about things, is laying out their cases. And so in the book, he just says that like they, in summary, our brains create schemas of perception, and eventually over the course of evolution, this this schema then eventually conglomerates into a sort of consciousness. So it was like a proto consciousness, and now we have our consciousness now, and our consciousness is going to keep evolving, as the human species comes on, or well, don't know how long human species will be here because we're kind of dumb, but um, it's kind of it'll keep evolving. So if anyone's looking for that, I would buy that book. But yeah, so I think on a pop level, it's a lot of dogmatic statements and no real good defenses.
Right. Who would you say? You said your three best philosophers of mind: Chalmers, and who were the other two?
Yeah, so for me, out of it's there's my personal top three philosophers, and then there's the top three like most influential philosophers of mine. So for me personally, I I like Chalmers, the way he writes, the way he presents things. Um, uh, I like I like Ward because he explains things pretty flat out, and then I'd have to go with Castrop just because he's kind of like moving the field forward. In terms of the top three most influential, it'd have to be Searle, um, Dennett, and Chalmers is probably the top three in terms of just the most influential in the
Searle,
field.
I don't know. Who? Tell me about Searle. I don't even know the name actually.
John Searle, he's written many books. His book, The Mystery of Consciousness, is really good. Um, I believe he is kind of like Chalmers in the sense that I think he's a kind of naturalistic dualist.
Right.
But
He
he
developed the like the Chinese room argument, which
right.
I really love too.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he took Frank Jackson's Chinese room argument and bumped it up like 3 levels. So he's kind of known for being a proponent of that. And then, he's very influential. And then you have Chalmers, who's obviously extremely well. And then you have Dennett, who is just he's very prolific in his writing. So everyone has to pay
Well, and
attention.
he's a four horseman, so people consider him. You know, that gives him so much. Like, so many of the atheists are like latch on to people like Dennett because of the standing of like being a four horseman type figure. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah. He's one of those people that he writes so well, and he presents his cases so dogmatically that people just really like him, and so he's just up there because he's just you know he's
right,
just
because
there.
he's smart enough and he's nuanced enough in his thinking that he can keep a false theory in play for a lot longer than it should be in play, because he can defend it in really ingenious ways, even though it doesn't work. That's kind of that's what I meant. He's like one of these people who are like,
So he's very good at he's very good at basically covering up a series with word salad. That's his smoke screen. I think I liked in it in the sense that I think he does really well at explaining the science, at explaining, like in his book Bacteria to Bach and Back, he explains the evolution of minds, reason, things like that, consciousness. Um, but I think his philosophy is terrible. Like, one of his main arguments he has his argument against qualia, and it's just basically, well, qualia is sort of kind of ill-defined, and we don't sort of really understand it, so it doesn't exist. Like,
right.
obviously, that's the straw man version, but that's kind of the summary.
Well, in his debate with Keith Ward, Keith Ward said, quote, consciousness is the most important thing about being a human being. And Daniel Dennett goes, yeah, I agree. What? Isn't that really like bizarrely self-contradictory?
Right. So I think this is one of my major problems is Daniel Dennett does a really great job of putting someone like that, someone with his beliefs, in an epistemic pitfall. Like, he's just great at screwing over naturalism. That is one great thing. Just because he's like, well, we illusion consciousness, or consciousness is an illusion, and we don't understand this and this, and our brains evolve reason through this and this, and our brains work this way. And then you're like, but all I get out of this is that our brains are untrustworthy. We don't really know we exist, and there's just nothing. Like, it's weird. So that's kind of one funny thing I find about him is he's great at like screwing his own position over.
Right. Well, because it's self-contradictory, and if you dig too deep into it, you start coming up against its own internal contradictions. That's the problem. So if he gets into a debate, I mean, I couldn't imagine him in a debate with someone. Sam Harris, Bernardo Kastrup was calling out Sam Harris on Twitter differently about idealism, and he was really upset. It was like Saturday or Sunday, and he was saying, like, I can't believe a public intellectual would have this shallow a misrepresentation of something like idealism. I challenge you to debate. And like, Sam Harris wouldn't be able to put points on the board against Kastrup in a debate. There's just there's no comparing them in terms of how well grounded and thought through their positions actually are.
I prefer it. Funny is that I actually prefer Anaka Harris, which is Sam's wife. She has a book out on consciousness, and she does.
Oh, I don't know her. That's cool.
Yeah, she does a really great job of explaining it, and I think she leans panpsychist, so it's really weird, But yeah, she does. I prefer her work. She does a really great job of explaining things. Sam is one of those people where I'm pretty sure every view he holds is just automatically wrong, just because he holds it. I mean, he's just one of those people. But yeah, I think it's just there, and you can never be too hard, because I think there are good arguments for materialism, right? So I think in the book Rethinking Consciousness, he lays out a very plausible theory. Well, not very plausible, but a plausible theory. Are
you talking Dennett or Sam Harris?
Not Sam Harris. Michael. I always butcher his last name, so I'm just not going to say it. But in the book Rethinking Consciousness, he does a great job of laying it out, and I think it's plausible. Now, I have my objections to it, and so I need to read like his more in-depth work. But I think he does a really great job. So, obviously I'm not saying that there are no good arguments for materialism. I'm just saying is that I don't think they fully convince me.
Right. Well, that's what I'm talking about. At the level we're talking about, there's no ruling out of the realm of possibility necessarily. Like, the best person streaming today right now is Dr. Richard Brown, and he's still calling himself a physicalist, and he'll go through the different types of physicalist positions, and like he's as intelligent as it gets. So intelligent people can hold to these positions. It's a question of degrees of convincing and like really thinking it through. It's not like you're ever going to rule it out of the realm of possibility necessarily.
Right. You think of like the most influential people in philosophy, and they were like atomists, or you had people, they were some of the greatest intellectuals on earth, and they thought the earth was flat. Like,
Right.
just because someone's smart doesn't mean every idea they propose is good or is valid or true. So I think
Right.
it's one of those major things. For example, Shannon Q, I enjoy her work, but she's very good at kind of like subtly doing it, but she's kind of be like, well, this scientist believes this, so we must believe this too. And it's kind of like, there's been so many people in history that have had, to us, obviously false beliefs, but still been brilliant. So it's kind of like we kind of have to draw a line.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know which did Shannon. Who does Shannon quote and say this scientist? I didn't know her to do that actually.
Yeah, so she proposes she does Mark Solms. So she's doing an interview with him, and I really like Mark. She's done this with Mark. She's done this with Patricia Churchland a few times. She's done this other places, like on other people's channels, but I obviously don't like. I enjoy her stuff on consciousness. Obviously, I think she does a good job of explaining it. But yeah, and this is something everybody does, not just her. Christians do it too.
No, we don't. That's wrong. We don't.
I do it too. It's just a natural.
John might do it. I don't do. I'm not even sure what it is we're doing, but I don't do it. I definitely don't. John definitely does. But go ahead.
Yeah, John, you just always do it. But yeah, everyone does it. It's just a natural thing to do. But yeah, that's one thing people have to be careful of.
Bring in the expert to say like this proves it, like this shuts down the argument because this expert agrees with me. Is that what you mean?
You have so many experts and so many brilliant people that have, prima facie just completely opposite views. They're just totally contradictory.
Right. And there's no consensus yet. So you can't really go this expert because, that's like with interpretations of quantum mechanics. There's no consensus. There's different schools of interpretations and they're held to by really credible people. So you can't just say like the experts are me because they're all over the place.
You've got multiverse theorists and string theorists and, just all kinds of people. And it's kind of like, everyone there, obviously, if you're in theoretical physics or quantum mechanics, you're smart. So everyone there is brilliant, but they have just completely conflicting views. So, basically saying you have the intellectual high ground because some intellect agrees with you, Now there's also things such as consensus, like evolution. I don't see how anyone can really reasonably deny it, without just kind of being a pseudoscience. So things like that. But again, it's kind of like you have people who deny that the Earth is round and evolution is true, stuff like that. They shouldn't be taken seriously, but because 99% of intellectuals agree, but still, just in things like consciousness, there is so much division. You can't just pick out one person and be like, "See, we have it all."
Oh yeah, no, it's not even close. The consciousness it's not even on the doorstep of understanding the mechanics of consciousness and the neural correlates. Never mind the hard problem. So there's no such thing as the experts think this. There are neuroscientists, and they tend to lean towards materialism, and that's usually for ideological reasons, not because they understand the philosophical arguments about the hard problem of consciousness. If you're steeped in materialism, you're steeped in examine the facts, morning, noon, and night. It's really hard for them to let go of that because that's what they're raised in.
Yeah, so this gets into, science is a very methodological naturalism type field, right? It's just
Right.
it's everything is natural, and you can have a God belief, but keep that out of science.
Keep that out. It's not scientific. Run the facts. Show us the equations. Run the experiments.
Yeah,
Facts, facts, facts.
it's a very dogmatic push. So, whenever people, well, consensus neuroscientists believe consciousness is physical or consciousness is material. Um, well, you may be right, but here's the thing. First, almost none will tell you they exactly know. They'll say, well, we think it's physical, but we don't know how, we don't know where, we don't know what causes it, we don't know how it evolved, but we think it's material. And so it's kind of like, and that's a big way is it just goes back to that naturalism, materialism thought that is kind of
Right.
ingrained in scientists. And so that's one big factor. Another factor is that, if some people are afraid to have different ideas, like you're working in a lab and
Dude, that's so much right there. Go ahead. But that's so much because if you
everyone around you is a materialist, and then you come out and you're like, oh, I believe this, then you're just not going to be taken seriously. It's a lot of
and
reputation.
you're also, if you're wrong, you fall alone. That's why so few people buck conventional wisdom in general. Like in I noticed this a lot with investments because there's like herd mentality in brokerage houses where they say, like, everyone says invest in Apple. And so everybody says invest in Apple. And if you're like doing your research on your own, you say, no, let's, invest in this, and you're wrong, you're laughing stock and you fall alone. Same idea in science. If you go out on a limb with a new theory and you're not right, that's too terrifying for most people to contemplate. So they don't even try to have original thoughts.
Yeah,
That's my theory, anyways. I think
and
you're
that,
saying the same thing.
and that is why people like Castro and even people like Dennett a while back or Chalmers, they are popular because they kind of came out and actually, well, I have this idea and I think
Right.
this.
Buck the system. Original. Chalmers is an original thinker. It's clear when you listen to it. Ditto for Castro. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that's you know Castrop is big because he shows, well, hey, my idea might actually be plausible, or this idea, I'm challenging the mainstream idea. And so, you know, for example, not necessarily a good example, but as an example, ID theory, so intelligent design. While I think they're wrong, I do commend them for kind of breaking away from just the traditional herd mentality. Um, I think I think there needs to be diversity.
Right.
That's how ideas come along. That's how different theories come along. That's how we make progress. If everyone in the Middle Ages agreed and nobody had any original ideas, and no one ever did their research besides just what other people believed, we would still think the Earth is flat. Like I think it's
Right.
just kind of you have to, and this is why I find just stating consensus is not always the best, because just because it's consensus doesn't mean it's true. Now there can be good reason for the consensus, but doesn't mean it's true.
Well, if it's consensus in science or history, you need to take it seriously and take that as your starting point. You can't really buck the system unless you really thought it through and you have the standing to challenge the consensus. Because a lot of times you can just be a crank. I don't believe that, World War II happened. Okay, well, you're wrong. You're mistaken. So a lot of times there's consensus for a reason, but consensus isn't the whole story. It's like
Yeah.
you have to be, you can't be afraid to throw out ideas that aren't working and rethink and start over. Which is what happened with Chalmers. Kind of started that with the hard problem of consciousness, is that he started looking at it in an original way, and like, we're not getting anywhere with just neuroscience. Maybe we need to rethink the whole approach, and that's what started the whole.
Right. So I think in terms of things like consciousness, you have to, so Daniel Dennett has written a lot of books. And in his books, he's always telling you, well, let's use these different thinking tools. Let's change the way we think about consciousness or the science behind it. So I think he has the right idea. I don't agree with his thinking tools, but I think because I think they're pretty biased. But still, I think he does. I think he at least has the right idea that we kind of need to think about things in science differently. I think we've kind of been stuck, and why we haven't been making it as ton of progress as some people have thought we, you know, people a while back, 50 years ago, thought we would have flying cars and be immortal, but we're still stuck with
I
high
know.
prices
Get
and
to work, man. All we have is cell phones. It's not, I want to be immortal and I want to fly around in my car. Some of
yeah,
these guys
I want
get
to
their act together.
I want to live in a Star Wars society. Come on, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like people thought we should be doing that. People thought we should be there, but we haven't, and that's because it's everyone stuck in just agreeing with everybody and kind of thinking the exact same way. And so I do think Chalmers and Searle and Dennett and people like that are influential because they brought new tools and they're saying let's think about this differently. And maybe one day we'll find out that Dennett is right. I don't know, but I mean, for now, I don't really think he's correct.
So cool. So Johnny, we got questions. Been about what, hour and 20 minutes? Ask some questions.
We have no questions yet, but if anybody has any questions for what is it, Lone Spartan Lone Spartan or
theology.
philosophy? Well, no, Spartan theology is
a different
Ethan,
guy. That's a totally different guy. Oh, okay. I thought it was
boy,
Spartan theology the whole time.
You've been talking to him this whole time. Like, wow, I didn't know
Really?
Spartan
I could have
theology
sworn it
became
was
an
Spartan. You
idealist.
told me it was Spartan theology earlier.
I mean,
This
Spartan
isn't Ethan?
theology was actually in the chat, but
Yeah, I figured it would be. It's not Ethan? Oh, okay. My bad. My bad.
I had a question though in regards to idealism. Is there a sort of incompatibility, do you think, between the notion of classical theism, where like God is identical to his essence and has no properties, and idealism?
Well, that'd be a little bit hard for me to explain just because I'm not a classical theist, but I'm not sure. Like, I think you could take a sort of uh like Thomist approach type thing, and I don't know, it would be weird. I can't really answer that because I'm not a classical theist.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I don't know. I have a buddy that's like a Catholic Thomist, but he's like follows Platonic theology, and so I don't know. Maybe there's a way in which to sort of square those. Okay, so we got a question from Sorry, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead. Who's asking?
Question from Theology Unleashed. How is idealism different from dualism if it holds to external world realism?
So
that's a good question. That's Ariuna.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, you go.
Go ahead. So the difference is first off, the external world is different. So on idealism, the external world is basically just kind of like random floating information in particles and quantum waves or whatever the heck you want to say is out there. While on dualism, there's actually something physical there. There's actually arrangements of particles, actual arrangements of atoms, actual physical things that aren't just kind of put there by our perception of them. So something like that would be that they're just different in terms of that. Another thing would be is that obviously on dualism, consciousness is not fundamental. So that's another big idea, is that consciousness is fundamental to the physical. So, on this type of external world realism, it's just different in that sense too.
You're done?
Yeah.
Oh. Ariuna,
Yeah, he's
The-
saying, but
the-
you still have two things: the world and the observers.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Well, so I guess it would be. I guess it's the same as dualism in the sense that there's an external world. It's kind of hard to explain. I'm like trying to figure out how to explain it so that it may just be a little bit vague and weird, but uh, it's kind of on dualism. There is obviously there's observers,
Mhm.
and then there's the actual physical thing. While on idealism, there is an external world, but it's not physical until there's consciousness there. So on dualism, there's an actual physical world there, regardless if there's conscious agents there, mental states there. While on idealism, you can't have the external world without consciousness. So it's kind of like flipping it, basically, sort of. I don't
Right.
know. This may not be making total sense because I'm trying to figure out how to explain it.
He's saying it sounds like a version of dualism, which is too wuss to admit who its parents are.
Is that what Aryuna said?
Yeah.
What a smart aleck. Dude, Aryuna, Vedanta Hinduism, those were the original idealists. That's where you hear Bernardo Kastrup mention that a lot. That's the original, like the Maya illusion. The real material world is an illusion. And then it was echoed by Schopenhauer and Kant, the German idealists.
Yeah, though I think Kant was sort of more epistemological in his idealism, not actually saying that the world is like that. Just
that's
that,
yes, I totally agree. There's a nuance there, and that's why I think, just to work off of that, Bernardo Kastrup, it may actually just be a heuristic or a interpretive framework. His idealism, like I don't think it's necessarily what I think. How it will prove most useful is as an interpretive framework, as consciousness is the ontological primitive. That's our starting point. And you can't have a relationship with the external world without experiencing it, obviously. And you're representing it back to yourself. So it's just like an interpretive framework, not necessarily, I don't know what the difference would be. Does that make sense, John? What I just said?
yeah, I can kind of see that. I don't know if Kashup would say that. It seems like he's like really doing metaphysics and not just like trying to.
Yes, I don't know if Castor would say that either. But
yeah, I get what you're doing.
What I'm grabbing onto, why I was interested in, I'm trying to apply this to apologetics. So, and Aryuna, you are too. So to prove the sky fairy, ultimately that's what I'm trying to do, is use this stuff to prove the sky fairy. So
the unicorn in the sky.
Right. The panpsychism is theist-friendly territory, and idealism is theist-friendly territory. So that's why I've latched onto them. It's not necessarily that I think they're right. It's that I think they're useful interpretive frameworks so that I can, prove the sky fair and get some tags.
I think most theories of consciousness can be theistic friendly. So I have a friend.
I've heard that, but I've never heard anyone explain it well. Like I saw a Christian physicalist. Go ahead.
There are Christian physicalists that kind of say, well, God didn't create us with necessarily consciousness that isn't produced by our brain. But then when he comes back, he's basically going to create us with this new eternal body. Like they kind of explain it so that it's still compatible with Christian theology. But I think something like dualism is obviously the mainly held.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can make anything compatible with Christian theology. Just say that's how God did it. Yeah, that's how God did it. Physicalists, that's how God intended it.
I mean, obviously, there are certain views that would cause more issues, kind of cause more doubt. Like, why would God give us consciousness if it's just an illusion, or
like making God into a type of or Cartesian demon, somewhat.
Yeah,
somewhat deceptive.
What's the reason why that doesn't make sense? But I guess, I mean, technically, you can argue, well, my case for theism is perfectly fine. So even if consciousness is an illusion, I still believe in God because there's still a good case for him or something like that. But yeah, you'd have to work around a few things.
Right. The way I see it is the materialists like Dennett and Patricia Churchland are making the same mistake that most apologists makes, just on the opposite side. They're trying to massage the facts. They're starting with the foregone conclusion. Materialism is true. And then they're massaging the facts to fit that. And Christian apologists usually do the same thing on the opposite side. God exists. Let's massage the facts to prove it. You know what I'm saying? So that I'm doing it differently. I'm trying it differently, going into theist-friendly territory and trying to get the facts of the matter and just assuming it will prove my sky fairy in the meantime.
I think I always try and start from so I think one reason I'm a deist is that I'm being pulled both ways. So I think more emotionally and somewhat evidentially I'm pulled towards theism, but also then I also have evidence that pulls me towards naturalism. So I always try and start from an unbiased position in anything I'm looking at. So whether that be consciousness, morality, I'm terrible at morality, so don't ask me about that. But God, religion, things like that. I always try and start with an unbiased perspective and kind of work from there.
Right.
I think that's a good way. I think starting. I think using some type of naturalism is some method is fine. Obviously, can't go too far, but I think that's fine too. Another thing I want to point out is Kastrup's version of naturalism is actually I think is probably one of the best versions of naturalism because it gets around a lot of different things. You don't have to deal with fine tuning. You don't have to deal with things like morality. You don't have to deal with just kind of gets around a lot of that stuff. So I think that's one thing, but
right. And he tripped out Myth Vision because he said, I'm materialism is false. And Myth Vision's like, so you're not a naturalist. And he's like, no, I very much am a naturalist. And Myth Vision was like, huh? Wait, what? Because a lot of people are using these terms in ways that are not precise. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's what happens. Physicalism usually only, when I say physicalism, I think it only applies to philosophy of mind, but sometimes it's being used other ways. I don't know, John, am I right? Is it only used in philosophy of mind, physicalism, or does it have other applications?
Well, I don't know. When I was talking to Jeffrey Williams, he uses physicalism as sort of just saying that all that we have reason to believe are physical things that exist.
Right. I caught that immediately that he was using it differently.
Yeah, generally though, it refers to human consciousness is purely physical. There's no immaterial or non-physical components.
Right,
to it.
And a lot of people will say physicalism and mean materialism, which is, materialism is the ontological primitive. And then a lot of people will say naturalism when they mean materialism. And there are really precise distinctions there that I never really bothered to go and iron out completely, so that I'm using the terms precisely. Normally with Kastrup, he uses his terms precisely as they're used in science and philosophy. Jeffrey Williams does too, usually in philosophy. As far as I can tell, he was using those terms accurately. John, what did you think?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. At least from within sort of a Heideggerian framework.
Right.
It seems like that's how he's sort of approaching philosophy.
Yeah. So I think defining terms is a big thing. Well, if you don't believe in God, you have to be a materialist. So but you can still. So you don't have to be a materialist, but you can also be a naturalist too. So there's a distinction.
Right.
So consciousness would technically be natural, and fundamental. So you can still be a naturalist as long as there's no God. Then if you don't believe there's no God, I don't see an issue with calling yourself a naturalist because consciousness is natural. So it's one of those
right.
things.
And Bernardo Kastrup, for example, he's not necessarily an atheist, but he doesn't believe in God. So his universal consciousness is not God. It sounds like he could be talking about God, but it isn't. He says he's no reason to think it has love for us and intentionality and cares when we fall down and stuff like that, and wants to protect us when we scrape our legs. So he has no reason to believe that his universal consciousness is a breathing like entity that cares for humanity or something like that. So he doesn't necessarily believe in God, but sometimes his universal consciousness sounds like God. That's why I latched onto it. I was like, wow, and it's very similar to, I don't know if you guys ever read Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's always talking about like the over soul and the over consciousness. And it was sort of a very similar idea.
Yeah. So I think a lot of things we can kind of like take out is that, number one, idealism doesn't necessarily deny an external world. Number two, materialism and naturalism are different. And like number three, just because they sound smart doesn't mean they're correct. Like, I think that's kind of like the three major takeaways. But yeah, I think
definitely those are good takeaways. Actually, just because they sound smart and they're well grounded in science doesn't mean they're right. That's an important one.
I'm sure the flat earthers back then were pretty grounded in their science, but they can't be right about everything. So it's kind of like, I think those are the three main takeaways.
Yeah, I think those are good takeaways. What do you think, John? Are there any questions left?
I had one more question. What would be sort of a reason to maybe favor idealism over a standard like conception of the mind as dualism, like holding to the sort of common sense default position of, the mind is immaterial, but there is a physical world that exists independent of any mind?
So like in terms of just as a starting point, like just like a middle ground, or like just favor it in terms of evidence?
Just to, I don't know, any reasons that you can think of that, like to maybe take somebody that already has sort of natural or like a default dualism to give them reason to sort of take some weight off of that position and maybe more weight onto the idealist position.
Yeah, so I think I would go a lot through like philosophy or like evidence from science or however you want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
I think dualism is a pretty good middle ground in terms of just trying to figure out where you stand. So I think I would just point out, well, hey, look at this issue with dualism, or look at this issue, or maybe take a look at this evidence for idealism, or maybe look at this. So I think I would just kind of like point them to resources and just kind of be like, well, you can make your own decision. I think different arguments, different things I would point them to. I don't think it really, it's just kind of like just point them towards the evidence you think is evidence and kind of let them decide.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. I think that's it.
Is that all she wrote? Did we close down the store? We closed up shop. Last call at the bar, and don't have to stay here. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. It's last call, guys. Any other questions? Any questions? Any questions? Get them out. Get them out. Get them out. Nope. And all right. So you heard it here. Idealism 101. We covered. I like the three takeaways. Give us the three takeaways again. These are the consensus that me, John, and Lone Sparta came to in this awesome conversation. What was the three takeaways? If someone's smart, don't trust them.
Right.
Doesn't mean it. Doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. They're super intelligent. They may not know. They may not be right. And what's the second one?
Materialism and naturalism are different.
Materialism and naturalism are different. That's a really big one. And if I could clearly articulate what the difference is, I would. But I don't. John, can you clearly articulate that in like 4 sentences so that everyone understands the difference?
Yeah, so naturalism would just be the notion that objects can exist without some sort of like something above them grounding their existence. Well, hold on. That would be at least one way in which naturalism is such a sort of like weaselly sort of word, because like I know some people will just say, okay, naturalism is just the position that only natural objects exist. So it's like, okay,
right. Yeah, that's what I mean. People use these
uninformative.
words really differently. Like Bernardo Kastrup seems to use naturalism as you think that the world obeys natural laws and science discovers those natural laws. So in that sense, I'm a naturalist, and we're all naturalists. I don't know if that's. I'm assuming that's.
There's other people though, like Jeff Lauder or Paul Draper, that think that naturalism is just like source physicalism. So like, if anything immaterial exists, then it's grounded in the physical things that exist. If anything, and besides that, it's just physical things exist. So in some sense, naturalism is at least very closely associated with materialism or physicalism in regards to philosophy of mind. But I don't think you have to be one, because like you could be maybe an epiphenomenalist, which is somebody that holds that the mind is an immaterial property of physical objects. So you think that, immaterial objects exist, but they just have no sort of causal relation to the physical world. And so you wouldn't be a physicalist in regards, well, maybe you would, I guess, in some sense. You at least wouldn't be a reductive physicalist.
Yeah. So you've got to be clear what people are talking about when you enter into these type of conversations. Because like they'll say, I'm a physicalist. And normally that's just referring to philosophy of mind. But a lot of times they'll mean naturalist or materialist, right? Is that a good summation? That you've got to be clear what people mean by the terms, because we use them all higgledy-piggledy in ways that they're not actually correct. We're not using them correctly. Let's put it that way. We're all over the place because we weren't, you got to be kind of trained in philosophy or science to use these terms correctly, I think. And what's the third takeaway?
That idealism doesn't necessarily mean there's no external world.
Yes, that's an important one. Idealism does not necessarily mean that there is no external world. We all know there's an external world. We're not, druggies. we're not like, yo, it's all mine, bro. It's just mine. It's so awesome.
There is nothing. I am just a robot that is it's just one of those, like, basically absolute idealism is just like flip illusionism. It's like on illusionism, it's like you're a meat robot, and on absolute idealism, you're just like a mind robot. It's just
right. You're just mind. It's all mind. Yeah, and there's no body experience at all. And there's no like little cat in front of me doing her own thing that I have no influence over. What do you want, sweetheart? So, should we close up shop? So, do we sum it all up in a nice little package? Gave people food for thought, intro to idealism, and make sure you watch Lone Sparta take down Bernardo Kastrup. He's going to destroy him in the interview.
I'm gonna wreck him. I'm just gonna destroy him. He's gonna be no more. I'm gonna ruin his career.
That's
You're gonna like pull out a rock and then like hit it with your hand. It's like, I refute idealism.
Yes, idealism debunked. Look. Isn't that like a famous thing, John? Isn't that like a famous rebuttal in like some debate with Berkeley or something?
Yeah, Samuel Johnson. His response to George Berkeley's idealism was just to kick a rock, and then he was like, "I refute idealism thus." And then a whole fallacy was like based upon that interaction. It's the appeal to the stone, I think it is, but it's
appeal to the stone
as well. Yeah, so it's kind of funny.
A lot of
times pointing to something that just doesn't actually refute. Like, I'm using this thing that doesn't really refute the position and saying that it refutes it.
Yeah, well, I have hands. I'm gonna be like, Kastrup, I have hands, therefore you're wrong.
Right.
Like, have you thought about this? Here's the hand, Kastrup. That's a good one.
It's pretty awesome. And we might actually land him on our channel too. John is in the process of pulling some strings and doing his John Buck thing. So it's possible he'll show up here. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, hopefully.
So,
all right, I'm ending stream.
And with that, it is a good night. Thank you all for coming and learning.
All right, we should be out. Yep, stream finished.
We're all fair?